Jane, you've just published a very insightful report on the Gulf crisis. It's nearly 2 years since it erupted, or since the blockade came into being. I mean, who would have imagined 2 years ago that this spat, as so many of us sort of defined it, would have continued for 2 years?
It almost seems like a new permanent rift in a Middle East region that is already experiencing a whole variety of divides between Islamists and secularists, between those allied with Iran and those opposing it, between Democrats and authoritarians. The region almost has no space for another major divide. But this one does, at least for now, appear that something that is here to stay. And I think for many outside observers it seems somewhat puzzling because especially the small Gulf states have more in common, one would think, than they do dividing them. But because the leaders of Qatar and of the UAE in particular have taken diametrically opposing views of political Islam, this has really locked them at each other's throats in a way that they just haven't proven able or willing to overcome.
So is that at the core of the struggle or the competition, the role of political Islam? It's not how so many others sort of in the press perhaps see it as a load of sheikhs squabbling.
The waters have really been muddied because when the quartet, as they're called, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain and Egypt, came out with their list of demands of Qatar, they came up with a huge list of demands that was really wide-ranging and basically confused everybody. And it included demands such as closing down the famous Qatari broadcaster Al Jazeera, which allowed Qatar to basically say our neighbours dislike us because we are a beacon of democracy and free speech in a region that lacks much of either. And this is what it's all about. But really, when you parse the grievances of the UAE and the other quartet countries, it's about their concern that as they saw it, Qatar was supporting political Islam. Qatar will say it was supporting popular movements, but its neighbours felt it was supporting political Islam even in the Gulf, and that this represented an existential threat to their own model of rule. So it's not just about games playing out in Libya, in Egypt, in Yemen, although all of these things matter. One of the things the paper is trying to highlight is that the UAE has accused Qatar of supporting dissidents in its own territory, in Emirati territory, and that is partly why this has been so fraught and so fractious. All that said, the UAE is a place that is pretty secure. Its rulers should be in a position of relative comfort with the wealth and development that they're able to offer their citizens, and it is perhaps surprising that the countries haven't been able to overcome their differences and find a modus vivendi. They are currently expending huge amounts of time and energy in undermining each other internationally, especially in Western capitals, lobbying against each other, and no one is winning.
What's the end goal? I mean, what is the end goal of the blockade, or what is Qatar's end goal in all of this? I mean, can we see a sort of point in the near future, in the distant future, where this is going to be resolved? I mean, what do the two sides actually want?
This is a really good question, and of course I mean that as I don't have a definitive answer. I think that there is a serious lack of clarity on this because the quartet began with very big ambitions. As I say, they had this huge list of demands they wanted Qatar to meet, and it appeared that they thought that the shock of the boycott and its impact on trade, investment, perhaps even the currency, would make Qatar change. That didn't happen. And it now seems that, at least in the short term, each side simply sees victory as not giving in. For the quartet, Qatar has been suffering to some extent from this. For Qatar, they have kept going despite the blockade. Interestingly, this has had some domestic political benefits for the young Qatari emir, Sheikh Tamim, because you've seen his population become highly politicised in a way that they never were, but in a very nationalist way where they have really rallied around him. I would argue that a fundamental miscalculation that the quartet made is that the way that they have sort of created this embargo punished the ordinary Qatari citizen. So they wanted the Qatari citizens to basically turn against the foreign policy pursued by their rulers, but the Qatari citizens in general were so aggrieved that they have done precisely the opposite. Nobody has been working on public diplomacy. It has all been attack and confrontation. And so currently, Qatar feels that it's succeeding because it is standing up. It's amazing that one of the world's richest countries can now cast itself as the underdog in all of this. And there doesn't seem to be a very clear way out. When you talk to diplomats from either side, they're not really talking about how to resolve this. They're talking about how they are looking to new alliances. So for Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they're focused very much on their bilateral alliance and also on working with countries like Egypt and Jordan, backed by the US, to kind of ally themselves against Iran. They're not talking so much about the Gulf Cooperation Council anymore. Qatar, meanwhile, has been strengthening its ties with Turkey, with a host of Asian countries, and to some extent with Iran. So it's very notable at their kind of flagship conference that they have every year, December, the Doha Forum. The big speakers were the foreign ministers of Turkey and Qatar and one of the main Palestinian negotiators, rather than anyone from the rest of the Gulf or the Arab League.
Sounds like this division is so deep. It's hard to, the way you've described it, it's hard to imagine the sides coming together at some point and reconciling. To what extent is this struggle personal? Is there a sort of personalised dimension to it? I mean, I understand the sort of the structural factors, but where do the individuals sort of sit within this play?
I think it is highly personalised. This dispute has really come about because of a generational change in the leadership of the countries, and they have moved away from the Gulf Cooperation Council, which was formed by their forebears. The Gulf countries have always had their differences, but since the 80s they had formed this grouping where essentially all the monarchs felt that they were better off trying to form some sort of bloc because they had more in common and more shared threats than they did to divide them. And really now we see a new generation coming through, first in the UAE and then increasingly in Saudi Arabia with the empowerment of the Crown Prince there, who don't see this unit as quite so valuable. They just don't have that same trust that the forebears had in each other. And the way this dispute has played out has also been very personalised. There's been a lot of very offensive content in the media aimed at each other, aimed at each other's family members and so forth. So it will be difficult. There will be a lot of pride to swallow, if there's to be some opportunity for them to sit down and work things out. But there are factors, that could lead to some kind of resolution, even if it's not a restoration of real trust and brotherhood. All these economies would benefit from being able to trade with each other again. You've currently got a rather odd situation where the GCC is supposed to be a common market, but there's an embargo within it. It's really quite a bizarre situation. And if the GCC wants to be making trade agreements with other countries around the world, perhaps even a post-Brexit Britain, which clearly would be very interested in that, it needs to have its own internal market functioning before it can really sign up to a free trade deal with others. This is obviously a time when all of the Gulf countries and all of the Gulf rulers are thinking about how they move beyond oil, how they find jobs and improve the education for their young people. And at a societal level, there is that interest in being able to study in each other's countries, work in each other's countries, invest in each other's countries. So there could be a rationale to at least wind down the blockade, even if differences over foreign policy persist.
Could the World Cup in 2022, could that be the catalyst for that change? Is that some, an event, a moment in the region that might help sort of bring the partners together?
There's still quite some time to go before the World Cup, and it's possible that that could present an opportunity for the sides to climb down and agree that it will be possible to trade again, it will be possible to travel again, that this will be a moment at which people from all over the Gulf would like to be able to participate. Perhaps their teams will be playing, There will be young people who want to volunteer. There'll be young people who want to attend. So I think this is the kind of big event that could focus people's minds.
You mentioned society and how members of the 6 different Gulf states like to move amongst the different states, and obviously there are strong familial linkages amongst them and between them, and youth are very dynamic and engaging. I mean, is there any sense that society itself can sort of push or help heal these rifts? Is there any room for them or even civil society to sort of push towards that?
I think there is, although I think the chances are also receding, because I think this, it isn't a dispute that came about from the societies. It's a dispute that is fundamentally over foreign policy, and Gulf societies don't really have a say in foreign policy. It tends to be very, very much driven by the leaders. And as you say, Gulf nationals tend to have strong family, tribal kinship and economic networks that go all across the Gulf countries. One of the problems is that now the governments are really using their control over the media to try to foment nationalism, which is useful for all of them because all of them are in these very young states. In most of the Gulf states, nationals are a minority of the population or only around half of the population. And many young Gulfies speak about uncertainty about their identity. So in some ways, this is useful to be able to encourage your population to focus on this nationalism, even if it's in quite a negative way. And it is also not easy for people to contradict their governments in any of these places. In some of the Quartet countries, it is illegal and people have been arrested for showing sympathy with Qatar. Qatar doesn't have quite the same thing in terms of the law, but it's still socially extremely difficult. Were you thinking that your government had done the wrong thing in Qatar, it would not be very easy to kind of stand up publicly and say that. So people who are trying to promote something that's more conciliatory are in an extremely difficult position, and it tends to be mainly behind closed doors in people's private majalis or maybe very quiet audiences with senior officials where members of the public might quietly say, maybe this is one problem too many, at a time when the Middle East is being beset by conflicts, pressures, political, economic and social. Perhaps this is something that we could start to cool down.
You mentioned that the competition, the conflict, the blockade, however one wants to describe it, was driven primarily from sort of a foreign policy perspective of different competing foreign policy agendas. How does that map out, or how is that mapping out in East Africa at the moment? What's the sort of impact that it might be having on Somalia, Ethiopia, or Sudan, in fact?
Yeah, well, I was keen to talk about this because I've recently returned from Ethiopia and had very interesting meetings with the African Union and others. And this is really a part of the world where the Gulf influence is growing very strongly. And the Gulf countries could have a massively positive role to play because whereas there are still many Westerners who look at that part of the world and see poverty and piracy, Gulf countries look at it and see prosperity. They see the new Silk Roads, they see China's Belt and Road Initiative, they see South-South trade, they see the Ethiopian market of over 100 million people, 10% growth a year, and they think this is an area to invest in and help develop the infrastructure. All of that is very exciting, but so sadly, it's happening at exactly the same time that the Gulf countries are at each other's throats. And so there's a lot of concern in some of these countries about being caught in the middle. We really saw it playing out in Somalia, where the federal government essentially switched sides to be with Qatar, and you then saw the UAE making close relationships and even military agreements with individual states within the federal system in a very fragile federal system where separatism is still a huge issue. So the kind of existing conflict dynamics in Somalia were reinforced by the Gulf conflict. And of course, Gulf actors have a very large amount of money to pour into supporting politicians in a way that tends to reinforce patronage and undermine the institutions that peacemakers are trying to develop In Ethiopia, you have seen something more significant because Saudi and UAE have been helpful in mediating and brokering the peace agreement with Eritrea, and that shows exactly the kind of constructive role that Gulf states can play. But now with the transition in Sudan, there's a great deal of concern that the Gulf countries will be trying to back different sides within Sudan merely because they're thinking of their own narrow interests. Who will the next government of Sudan side with? Whereas obviously Sudanese people and Sudanese protesters and the representatives of civil society and political parties don't prioritise those issues. You know, they want to find a way forward to have a transitional government in Sudan that represents civilians and starts to take that country out of the multiple conflicts it's been experiencing for decades. They don't need somebody else's conflict to be imported.
Where are the sort of the large international powers in this? You know, if we went back to the sort of bipolar era, you know, we would have seen the US and its allies lined up against the Soviet Union and its allies sort of coming into this. In the unipolar moment, the US would have sort of corralled everybody and said, come on, this is enough, we're gonna shift this out. Where are those powers now? I'm not quite sure how we define this era, if we're moving from a unipolar to a multipolar era, but where are they now, and how are they trying to sort of shape and influence the outcome of this competition?
Well, I would argue that it's really shown the ineffectiveness of international powers and their tendency to try to hedge their bets at a time of uncertainty in the region. The US is the most significant power, but it has muddled through because its own policy hasn't been clear. So you saw at the beginning of the whole dispute, the president tweeting very supportively of Saudi Arabia and the Quartet, but at the same time very different signals coming out of the State Department and the US military underscoring the fact that they have their major Middle Eastern air base in Qatar. So the US has really mixed its messages. It has from time to time tried to pull the Gulf countries together because its real interest is in trying to have a common Gulf front against Iran, but it hasn't been doing that in any kind of concerted, well-organised, consistent way. And ultimately it's allowed things to drift. And other international powers are really not much better. And it's led to a certain amount of cynicism in the Gulf, where, believe it or not, people are often quite cynical about Western policies, and they note that Western companies are making large amounts of money from arms sales to the region, and they wonder how interested are external powers in actually fixing this. Do they have more to gain from a divided Gulf? Now, that may sound a bit conspiratorial, but it's a perception that's out there. And I think in some ways, Western countries have been trying to see, you know, how can they benefit from this situation? So Qatar has been extremely keen to please its Western allies. It's been bending over backwards to show in very public ways that it's cooperating on counter-terrorism, because the Quartet are accusing it of doing quite the opposite. It has opened up its investment laws, you know, it's making things somewhat better for foreign workers, although the situation is still very tough. So in some ways, the rest of the world are seeing Gulf countries, you know, do things that they've been wanting them to do for quite some time. And it's really the GCC states that could benefit from having much greater international bargaining power if they stuck together.